You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
The French Revolution set Europe ablaze. It was an age of enlightenment and progress, but also of tyranny and oppression. It was an age of glory and an age of tragedy. One man stood above it all. This was the Age of Napoleon. I'm Everett Rummage, host of the Age of Napoleon podcast. Join me as I examine the life and times of one of the most fascinating and enigmatic characters in modern history. Look for the Age of Napoleon wherever you find your podcasts.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode 467 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast.
As promised, with this show, we'll be starting in on a new story arc as we take a look at the Red River Campaign. During the warm, humid spring of 1864, deep in the interior of northern Louisiana, a riveting drama unfolded as the Federals kicked off a bold attempt to capture Shreveport, which was the capital of Confederate Louisiana.
The campaign featured one of the largest combined Army-Navy operations of the war, as the Federals committed tens of thousands of soldiers to the expedition, and 90 Navy warships and transports steamed from the Mississippi up the narrow, treacherous Red River. Troops from as far away as Little Rock, Arkansas, were involved in the effort to capture Shreveport.
Now, you might ask, and not without reason, why Shreveport? After all, it's the spring of 1864, and there are bigger fish to fry. So a major campaign targeting Shreveport, of all places, out in the boondocks of the Trans-Mississippi, up the Red River, in the interior of Louisiana, seems, on the face of it, a questionable strategic choice. I mean, entering 1864, the short list of targets for the Federals, in order of importance, would be Richmond, Atlanta, and Mobile. Perhaps Charleston, as the birthplace of the rebellion, could be added to that list, but it was already under siege from the Army and Navy, and landward pressure after the fall of Atlanta would seal Charleston's fate.
And Mobile, Alabama, the last deepwater port on the Gulf of Mexico in Confederate hands, was on Ulysses S. Grant's wish list, but Richmond and Atlanta were far and away the obvious, most important targets for the Federal spring campaigns. By targeting those two cities, the Federals would draw out the rebels' two main field armies, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of Tennessee, and the defeat of those armies would hasten the fall of the Confederacy and lead to the end of the war.
So, back to our original question, why Shreveport? Why did the Federals, in the spring of 1864, when there were bigger fish to fry, decide to take the time and make a major expenditure of resources to target Shreveport, of all places, out in the Trans-Mississippi, up the Red River, in the interior of northern Louisiana? Well, the answer to that question isn't simple, but it is rather fascinating and is certainly a tale worth telling. So let's dig into it.
At the time of the 1864 Red River Campaign, Shreveport, which was not yet 30 years old, had a population of about 12,000 people, including refugees from eastern and southern Louisiana and from Arkansas and Missouri.
The town, located on the west bank of the Red River in extreme northwestern Louisiana, was a primary cotton exporting point, the location of a Confederate Army headquarters, and also the hub of a thriving small-scale war industry with a navy yard, factories, foundries, powder mills, and arsenal. It was on the major route of goods and supplies coming into the Confederacy from Mexico through Texas. So all of that's to say, Shreveport was certainly a legitimate military target, but it was also, strategically speaking, on the back end of nowhere, far removed in the spring of 1864 from the probable major battlefields of the war.
The primary reason out of the way Shreveport became the target of a major federal push was cotton. The Red River Valley in Louisiana, southwestern Arkansas, and deep eastern Texas was the greatest cotton-producing region of the Confederacy.
The weather in 1863 had been perfect, rainy at the beginning of the growing season, but not too wet. Then, as the cotton plants matured, a dry spell ensured a bumper crop. By late winter of 1863-64, tens of thousands of cotton bales had been harvested by plantation slaves and processed at hundreds of local gins, then moved by wagons to landings. They were sitting on the banks of the Red River and its tributaries, ready for shipment southward. In addition, late cotton crops were still growing and had not yet been harvested. The existence of all this white gold was the reason that Shreveport was added to the Federal's target list, since cotton was an irresistible lure to the north, particularly the textile mills of New England, which were starving for it.
And so, cotton, or the lack of it in the North, played a key role in the early planning of the Red River Campaign. The chance to capture a large supply of cotton, ship it to New England, and bring the textile mills back online was a tremendous political opportunity.
Abraham Lincoln needed New England's votes in the upcoming 1864 presidential election. The region's favorite sons, political generals Benjamin Butler and Nathaniel Banks, exerted enormous influence back home. Lincoln was no fool and knew that a large transfusion of Southern cotton into New England in 1864 would pay huge political dividends.
The textile industry was a major part of New England's economy, and there were massive layoffs when the war cut off the industry's lifeblood, Southern cotton. Of the almost 5 million spindles in the mills in New England before the war, only 25% were still operating by 1862.
We've talked about political general Benjamin Butler quite a bit previously on the podcast. He was a Democrat, a native son of New England. In fact, he was raised in the mill town of Lowell, Massachusetts. And Butler wasn't an original thinker, but he knew how to jump on a bandwagon and make the most of a situation. As the supply of Southern cotton dried up in 1861, New England politicians, bankers, and mill owners bombarded Lincoln for relief. Since the cotton shortage could be solved only by liberating cotton-producing areas of the South, Butler proposed an amphibious invasion at some point along the Texas coast. However, as the calendar rolled over from 1861 to 1862, he learned that an expedition aimed at capturing New Orleans was in the works, and Butler, ever the opportunist, became one of the leading proponents of that plan. As a result, when the operation was given the green light, David Farragut was named the naval commander, and Butler was chosen to lead the army forces assigned to the expedition.
After New Orleans was captured by the Federals in April 1862, Butler was named the city's military governor. His administration was highly unpopular with the locals, who hated him and called him Beast Butler, and famously even used chamber pots with Butler's portrait painted in them.
Well, Abraham Lincoln had hopes that Louisiana would be the first reconstructed state to re-enter the Union, but Beast Butler's heavy-handedness and corruption weren't helping win over the citizenry. So Butler was pulled from New Orleans in December 1862. To replace him in Louisiana, Lincoln chose another political general from Massachusetts, this time a Republican, Nathaniel Banks. In his youth, Banks had worked as a bobbin boy in a textile mill. From being a lowly mill worker, Banks became a wealthy, self-made man. He was politically ambitious and served as a multi-term governor of the Bay State. He had also served in Congress, even becoming Speaker of the House, and he had presidential aspirations. Banks was a political heavyweight in New England, and mill owners had a natural ally in him.
Based solely on his political pull, Banks had been catapulted to high rank very early in the war, in May 1861, by Abraham Lincoln. But unfortunately for the Union, despite his lofty rank of Major General, Nathaniel Banks' complete lack of military training and command experience were on full display in the Shenandoah Valley, where he'd been roughly handled by Stonewall Jackson.
When it became obvious Butler needed to be pulled from New Orleans, the choice of Banks as his replacement provided several apparent benefits to the Lincoln administration. First, Abraham Lincoln could put a savvier political operator in Louisiana, someone who understood the assignment, someone who could help diffuse the volatile situation at New Orleans and rejuvenate the stalled Reconstruction process in Louisiana.
Second, Banks' assignment to Louisiana would go a long way toward quieting the persistent pleas of the unhappy New England mill owners. In Banks, the mill owners knew they had an ally who understood the importance of increasing the amount of cotton sent north.
And third, regarding Lincoln's aim to secure the Republican nomination in 1864, sending a potential rival like Banks to Louisiana would put considerable distance between him and his base of support in New England, and thus make him less of a threat to Lincoln's chances to once again top the Republican ticket.
Hey there, I'm Dylan Lewis, one of the hosts of Motley Fool Money. Each weekday on Motley Fool Money, we talk through the business news you need to know and the stories moving stocks on Wall Street. On weekends, we dive into the industries shaping tomorrow and host the experts, authors, and executives that understand them. Tune in for insights, a long-term perspective on investing, and of course, stock ideas. Plenty of them. To quote a listener, it pays to listen. Check us out and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
Want to learn how you can make smarter decisions with your money? Well, I've got the podcast for you. I'm Sean Piles, and I host NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast. On our show, we help listeners like you make the most of your finances. I sit down with NerdWallet's team of nerds, personal finance experts in credit cards, banking, investing, and more. We answer your real-world money questions and break down the latest personal finance news. The nerds will give you the clarity you need by cutting through the clutter and misinformation in today's world of personal finance. We don't promote get-rich-quick schemes or hype unrealistic side hustles. Instead, we offer practical knowledge that you can apply in your everyday life. You'll learn about strategies to help you build your wealth, invest wisely, shop for financial products, and plan for major life events. And you'll walk away with the confidence you need to ensure that your money is always working as hard as you are. So turn to the nerds to answer your real-world money questions and get insights that can help you make the smartest financial decisions for your life. Listen to NerdWallet's Smart Money Podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
After taking over command of the Department of the Gulf from Butler at the end of 1862, Nathaniel Banks, in 1863, assisted Ulysses S. Grant in securing the length of the Mississippi River for the Federals.
While Grant, from upriver, worked to get at and capture Vicksburg, Banks, from downriver, laid siege to Port Hudson in May. Banks' subordinates were in favor of starving the Confederates into submission, but Banks decided to launch an assault on the strong enemy works. The poorly conceived, uncoordinated Federal attacks resulted in heavy casualties. Undeterred by that costly failure, Banks decided to try another assault in June, which also was defeated by the Confederates. In the end, it would be July before Banks captured Port Hudson, when the garrison surrendered after they received word that Vicksburg had fallen to Grant.
Banks' performance at Port Hudson had been far from spectacular, but nevertheless, in 1864, he would be given a much more difficult assignment, which would lead to the Red River Campaign. You see, back in the midst of the secession crisis of the winter of 1860-61, Mexico was concluding a 3-year civil war that had pitted the Republicans of Benito Juarez against the Conservative Party, made up primarily of wealthy landowners.
Immediately before the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, Juarez had ousted the Conservatives from power and confiscated much of their land. Many of the Conservatives fled to Europe, where they tried to persuade the monarchies there to establish a monarchy in Mexico to help them regain their lands. One of the displaced Conservatives gained the ear of the French Empress, who encouraged her husband, Napoleon III, to support the plan.
In the meantime, the United States had recognized the new Republic of Mexico and saw any efforts on the part of European powers to undermine that government as a threat to the United States. Nonetheless, certain European powers planned to do just that.
In the fall of 1861, Great Britain, France, and Spain dispatched a joint military expedition to Mexico, ostensibly to ensure the collection of debts. However, both Abraham Lincoln and Secretary of State William Seward believed the real purpose of the expedition was to overthrow the Mexican government and establish a monarchy in its place. They were concerned that if that happened, the new Mexican monarch would establish ties with the Confederacy, perhaps even instituting a formal alliance, and thereby make the United States' task in putting down the rebellion that much harder.
The European powers involved, however, assured the Lincoln administration that their aim was merely to ensure the collection of debts, and to that end, all they would do was land at Veracruz and take control of the port city's customs house.
Because their part of the expedition was sent from nearby Cuba, the Spanish arrived first in December 1861. The French and British arrived 3 weeks later. While the British government instructed their force not to leave the coast, the French and Spanish contingents had been told by their governments that they could advance into the interior of Mexico.
In March 1862, Seward issued a strong admonition to the European powers, warning them to withdraw their forces from Mexico. By that time, the invaders were squabbling among themselves, and shortly thereafter, the British and Spanish withdrew.
The French remained, and Napoleon III began actively working to overthrow the Juarez government and place Ferdinand Maximilian, the younger brother of the Austrian emperor, on the throne of Mexico. The Confederate government believed that this would work in their favor. You see, from Richmond, the Davis administration had made overtures to the Juarez government, but when Confederate Secretary of State Robert Toombs sent John T. Pickett to offer a treaty of alliance and friendship, he'd been rejected. As a result, the Davis administration saw a decided advantage in a new, friendlier Mexican government.
In June 1863, French troops took Mexico City, putting the government back in the hands of the conservatives, who later in the year issued an invitation to Maximilian to accept the crown of Mexico. Juarez was forced to flee to northern Mexico, where he conducted a guerrilla war against the French military forces.
And that pretty much brings us up to where we are on the podcast timeline. In June of 1864, Maximilian and his wife Charlotte would be crowned emperor and empress in Mexico City. But a year earlier, in the late summer of 1863, with all the troubling goings-on south of the border, the Lincoln administration believed planting the U.S. flag on Texas soil had become a diplomatic and political necessity to nip in the bud any French imperial ambitions that would include any sort of alliance with the Confederates.
Nathaniel Banks later said that when General-in-Chief Henry Halleck began to pressure him to initiate a campaign that would plant the U.S. flag on Texas soil, Halleck proposed an expedition up the Red River as a way to get over into East Texas. But Banks thought that a better idea would be to land a force at Sabine Pass, at the mouth of the Sabine River on the Texas coast, from which point the Federals could move to capture Houston.
As you guys will recall, we covered the September 1863 Federal defeat at Sabine Pass back in episodes 389 and 390. Besides the failure of the expedition to plant the flag in Texas, of interest to us in our current story is that Banks blamed the fiasco at Sabine Pass on the Navy. Well, neither the Army nor Navy was blameless, having invested little time in planning the operation, but Banks' very vocal criticism of the Navy caused a rift between him and naval commanders David Farragut and David Dixon Porter. That distrust would only increase in the coming months.
In late October 1863, Banks sent out another expedition, this one with even less planning and preparation. Halleck was still pressing for a push up the Red River, but Banks' idea this time was for a force to march overland through the Bayou Teche country and into the prairie of southwestern Louisiana to a point somewhere on the Sabine River, where the expedition could cross into East Texas.
The overland expedition was a failure, but in conjunction with that movement, the Navy landed troops at several remote points along the lower Texas coast. As a result, Banks reported to Washington that, quote, "the flag of the United States floated over Texas today," end quote. Well, Banks made it seem like these landings were major enterprises and a phenomenal success. Banks was very pleased with himself. But in reality, the flag of the United States was flying over uninhabited sand dunes on barrier islands, and the total effect on the Confederates was trifling.
Nathaniel Banks hadn't informed Henry Halleck in advance of any of this, and Halleck, who saw that Banks was simply trying to put lipstick on a pig, wasn't happy that Banks had once again ignored his suggestion to strike up the Red River, then march over into East Texas.
Halleck fired off messages to Banks expressing his displeasure. Halleck then wrote letters to William Tecumseh Sherman, who had succeeded Grant at the head of the Army of the Tennessee, and to Major General Frederick Steele, the newly appointed commander of the Department of Arkansas, soliciting their opinions about a Red River expedition. Steele's department bordered the target area, and Sherman was very enthusiastic about the idea. In fact, he wanted to command the expedition personally, and operated for a time under the assumption that he'd do so.
Before the war, Sherman had spent a year and a half as the superintendent of the Louisiana Seminary of Learning and Military Academy at Pineville, across the Red River from Alexandria. He knew more about the area than any of the officers involved and could have provided much valuable information, particularly to the Navy.
Halleck next tried to get Ulysses S. Grant on board, but Grant and Banks at this time were both in favor of a move on Mobile. Banks could almost see the newspaper headlines trumpeting his capture of the port. But Halleck, who could be downright Machiavellian at times, wrote a clever letter insinuating the president thought initiating a Red River campaign was more desirable than the capture of Mobile, and implying Lincoln saw Banks' footholds on the Texas coast as merely the first step in a grand scheme to recover the Lone Star State.
In the end, Halleck got his way. Grant chose not to make a movement against Mobile, a make-or-break issue, and he reluctantly agreed to a campaign up the Red River to capture Shreveport.
Banks also came on board once he realized which way the wind was blowing. He may not get to be the conqueror of Mobile, but personally directing a successful military campaign in Louisiana would still get his name in the newspapers. And it would please his New England textile mill owner political allies by ensuring thousands of bales of captured cotton were sent north. And so, by the third week of January 1864, Nathaniel Banks, the Bobbin Boy governor, now general, was an enthusiastic supporter of a campaign to strike up the Red River, a campaign that would take him to Shreveport and perhaps beyond, maybe even all the way to the White House.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Pretense of Glory, The Life of General Nathaniel P. Banks by James G. Hollinsworth, Jr.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website is information on how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon, just like Nick, Johnny Reb, and Anne have done recently. We want to say thank you to them for their support of the podcast.
Thanks also to Ed R. for his donation. And thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.